Smalls. I suppose you don't even know who the babe is either. It's plug. What? Chewing tobacco?
Tobacco, man.
What do you do with it? You're killing me, Smalls.
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes, and there have been a couple of creators in hot water lately, and we won't get into the specific controversy regarding what happened with Leah Williams and X Factor, but I do think one thing that kind of played into that was Leah Williams leaning into like a true life story to kind of, it's essentially what she's adapted, that Ed Buck controversy, tragedy really, into what she was doing on X Factor that really upset people. I do have a comic book writer that's a friend of mine that has leaned into some current trends and topics and things that are happening, but he's done it more in a satirical state. I wanted to get his thoughts on, taking real life stories and putting them into your comic and having them be the basis of your story. Obviously, the man I'm talking about is Mark Pellegrini. Just finished up the ultra successful Black Ops X Common America. I think it went over $100,000. How's it going, Mark?
I'm having a fantastic 4th of July. One, because it's the birthday of our country, but also because, as you said, Black Ops X Common America exceeded our expectations. So I am in an upbeat mood today, and I'm not going to be negative, I promise.
Absolutely. That's great. So certainly, if you look at The Watchmen, that incorporates maybe not a frontline story, but like an atmosphere during the Cold War. It is the backbone of the tone of that story. You can even think about on television, you have, Law and Order. All of their stories are basically based on, true life events. They adapt them to the story and whatever they're working with. That's like a periodic crime drama. I think a lot of people read these superhero comic books specifically for escapism. And I think it turns a lot of readers off.
I mean, I'm not against using current events as an element in your storytelling. You shouldn't lean on it as a crutch where every story is based on current events or trying to be timely and topical and ripped from the headlines, because then that ends up immediately dating your material. It's like, as much as I enjoy South Park, I feel like I only understand. Yeah, I feel like I only understand episodes from 10 years ago because I lived through them. I imagine like a 13-year-old now trying to go back and watch episodes that took place during like the Bush administration or something like that. Episodes that were super topical. Like they did like one about like Elian Gonzalez, like who even, if you weren't alive during the whole Elian Gonzalez immigration in Cuba thing, like who would even remember that? It makes those jokes so impenetrable now without a historical context. That they were very, very funny when they were released, when it was a brand new episode. But now it's like you've got to have like annotations. You got to go to the South Park wiki to understand like what an episode was about 15 years ago. And that's always the downside of trying to keep your stories topically relevant. Now there's nuance to it. You can, of course, you can do it in a way where it's very deliberate and very much requires the understanding of the current events, and that makes it difficult for your material to be read a decade from now. Or you can infer the current events, but keep it broad enough that, like in Black Ops Volume 1, it's about USAGI going into North Korea to stop a nuclear launch. Now, while we base that off the Hawaiian nuke scare that happened around the same time as that, it's still a general enough idea. Like it's just a commando going into enemy territory to defuse a bomb. You don't have to know about the Hawaiian nuclear scare to understand that story. And in fact, you could almost be completely unaware of that historical event. And most people have already even forgotten about it and still enjoy the story.
If you don't remember, that's when I believe it was the Hawaiian government accidentally sent out like a warning that said the imminent attack.
Right. I mean, and we
forgot that this is a drill part.
Yeah. Right. So, yeah, you can do something like that where, if someone who was there and lived through it will read that book 10 years from now, like, oh, okay, I see what they did. Whereas someone who's younger and has no idea can read the book and just fully understand the story and be fine with it. Or you can do something like we did with Wall Might, which was very much a Trump administration parody and satire. Everything's based off of the current events of the Trump administration. Trump administration's over, so that book is very much just a trapped in amber relic of the 4 years in which Trump was president. And we made it very much to be enjoyed at the moment, but ultimately something that's, unless you were there at the time, you're going to read that book 15 years from now and you're not going to understand a word of it. And we understood that at the time. So as long as you're going in with the intention of making it one or the other, and your approach, your execution is done for one or the other, then that's fine. But a lot of these comics, they don't really match their execution with their intention.
That's the real problem with X Factor #1. Leah Williams did pretty good on her Amazing Mary Jane story. People really like that, but she's actually worked in the entertainment industry, and you would think that, okay, she adapted the story of Mary Jane going to Hollywood, and she was able to do it successfully. The story that's the backbone of X Factor #10, with Prodigy, finally uncovering who his murderer was, it ends up being like this Hollywood producer that preys on young queer people of color as his victims, clearly based off of the Ed Buck story that came out a few years ago, when I believe they found like the third victim in his home, and then finally, thankfully he's in prison. There, he can't do it anymore. That is really heavy stuff, Mark. And if you're not a nuanced enough or competent enough writer, you could really fumble that and do it in a way that really offends people.
It's that almost, it's like a joke where someone's like, too soon, bro, too soon. But, realistically, if this was something that only happened a couple of years ago, that could very much be construed in poor taste, since there are still grieving individuals out there, and we're still uncovering bodies of this, multiple murderer. It really depends on how tastefully they're executing the allegory to this event. Now, there are a lot of movies and TV shows and things that have adapted serial killers from the past, mostly horror movies. Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Ed Gein is the basis for Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I think Friday the 13th. He's the backbone of a lot of characters.
The big one. Silence of the Lambs, took a lot of stuff from Ed Gein's story. The Hills Have Eyes by Wes Craven is based off the Sonny Bean murders, but the difference is that the Ed Gein murders were like 40 years before Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The Sonny Bean murders were like 100 years before Hills Have Eyes. There had been time, and they were very, very loose adaptations in those movies. Mm-hmm. This seems more like someone who's like, I'm out of ideas. He was taking
direct details of the event that
this
came out and were in the news.
Yeah, the X Factor book, it's like someone was like, I'm out of ideas, so I'm just going to read the Wikipedia article on this person and adapt it into my story. It seems a little less authentic and a little less tasteful than doing something like that. I haven't read the whole arc, so maybe it'll be better, but
you won't, because this is the very final issue, and that's another thing that came into this. As a writer, you have to realize your run is being shut down 3, perhaps 4 issues early. She was unaware of it. So Leah Williams concludes that story arc and a couple of other ones in this issue, but also has the death of Scarlet Witch as the very last page. And even if she execute it perfectly, you got this weird death on the end that's going to overshadow the story. And are you giving it, the proper care that you should? She should have been aware that I can't complete this right here.
That's the thing is, that's a bad situation to be in as a writer. So a lot of the blame on that falls on the editors for saying, oh, by the way, we're canceling your book, 4 issues early, so you got to wrap everything up now in 1 issue. And I know that's a long story in comics. It happens all the time. They can't always predict, that a story is just.
Sometimes you got to leave a dangling plot thread if you just don't have the time and care to be able to include it.
What's that saying? It's a video game saying. I think it was from Miyamoto, Shigeru Miyamoto, who said it. It's like, a rushed game will be bad forever. A late game will at least be good eventually. And I guess sometimes you have to do that in comics, especially corporate comics like Marvel and DC. There's going to be another X Factor, or the X Factor are going to appear in another X book at some point. There will be an opportunity to tie up that storyline, those loose ends. It's not like it's your indie comic that's if you have to cancel it all of a sudden on a cliffhanger, there may never be a continuation. No, this is Marvel. There's always going to be another X book. So sometimes you just have to say, like, okay, I can't finish this now. I can either rush everything to conclude it in one issue and have it can be completely unsatisfying and potentially in poor taste because I decided to rip my storyline from current events, or I can leave it at a cliffhanger and get the opportunity to sew these loose ends up later on in either another, when they relaunch X Factor, like they will, the new #1, or the X Factor will show up in like X-Men or something, or Avengers because it's Scarlet Witch, and that'll be your opportunity then to sew those storylines up because it's Marvel and they do it that way. I feel like it was bad for the editors to put her in that position, but she also, as a writer, needed to be prepared and understand there are better options than what they did.
Yeah, that one didn't work out. There was another comic that's just launching, Ninjak #1. This is the relaunch of one of the more successful characters for Valiant. There's been a lot of criticism regarding the art, from myself included. I think it looks
it's awful.
It's so awful. But the very first issue essentially is reenacting the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi Arabian journalist who had to go into hiding and exile, returned to Saudi Arabia, and very bad things happened to him. That's really soon to be doing something that was really in the headlines and caused a ton of strife across multiple countries and cultures.
Yeah, I mean, all I really know about that one is what I was reading up on this article. Now, they are touching on some pretty delicate threads there, and I do think that for a lot of these writers, especially in Marvel and DC, is that they're very selective about what current events they're going to refer to directly or allegorically adapt or whatever. Saudi Arabia and all these Middle Eastern countries are throwing gay people off of rooftops and burning them alive and stoning them, and yet we'll still end up with something like The Handmaid's Tale, that talks about how evil Christians in the United States are. They'll be very selective about what they ignore and what they adapt. It depends on their personal worldview. I do think it's very interesting that Ninjak chose what I would think would be among the corporate comics, Hivemind would be an unpopular current event to adapt. So I do respect that they chose one that
people are very upset about what happened to Jamal Khashoggi. They came down like a ton of bricks on Saudi Arabia. They actually had to respond, which they normally don't do after what they did to the man. Like he, by accounts, I believe he was hacked into pieces by the security there. So
no, it was bad. I'm honestly, it's one of those things where I'm surprised that this is the one that they finally chose to address. Like where was Marvel and DC and Valiant and all these books during the Charlie Hebdo massacre? Why weren't they making comments about that and putting allegories to that in their books? No, because that's we can't talk about that. That's Islam. We they were scared. They didn't want that to happen to their offices. It's like when again Viacom and Comedy Central wouldn't let South Park show Mohammed because they were scared, and then that just proves that terrorism works. And this is more criticizing a rich royal family rather than exactly. And that's it's almost like they're kind of finding their little in there to criticize Saudi Arabian government without addressing the religious aspects of it, despite the motivations. Or like Theo Van Gogh, who was a director who was murdered because of his views and his films that addressed Islam, and he was murdered very brutally over it. But again, it's selectivism. They're not going to attack these topics in their books that could be seen as politically incorrect or be construed that way, no matter how reprehensible or disgusting they are. So we are going to see it. We've been seeing a lot of that in media is the selectivism when it comes to what current events can be condemned or alluded to or adapted as a storyline. Though honestly, the most offensive thing about Ninjak is that art. It's holy cow, that is awful.
That art is bad, but me personally, I wish we could get escapism back into comic books. I read, the United States Captain America 1, over this past week, and
Yeah, I mean, there's that old argument that but comics have, especially superhero comics, have always been this way, and they always go back to Action Comics #1 when Superman was beating up corrupt landlords, or the entire World War II cycle of American superhero comics when they were punching
Captain
out
America's first cover where he's punching out Hitler.
Yeah. And then the 1950s Atlas era Captain America, where he's bashing commies and stuff like that. Like, yes, superheroes have always been, been topical, but it's always been in a way, especially during the World War II stuff, where it was very much a very cut and dry good versus evil narrative. It wasn't necessarily something like a lot of modern comics where the entire past 4 years of Marvel and DC were like, look, MODOK is Trump. Look, the Mandarin is Trump. Look, Dr. Doom is Trump. Look, Magneto is Trump. Trump. Like, just evil, specifically picking on something that's dividing within the nation and not an exterior threat that's uniting the globe against it, which is what World War II was. Now, they've had topical comics. Like, back in the 70s, I really enjoy Steve Englehart's run on Captain America, but that was all one big allegory for Watergate and Nixon. The thing is that because Englehart was such a good writer back then, was like, yes, you could read it now and have no idea that it was about Watergate. It was just about a corrupt politician, not necessarily the president. He just managed to kill himself in the Oval Office when he tried to escape there. It's all inferred that it was Nixon, but not necessarily. If you did not know about the entire Watergate scandal and everything going on when that was written, you just read it as another story about Captain America teaming up with the X-Men and the Avengers to go against, it was a hate monger, right? Who was a corrupt politician at a very high level office in DC. And that's a universal story. We have corrupt politicians in very high offices in DC to this very day who need to be taken down and pegged by superheroes. But it was written with a level of tact and strategy, which we're not seeing in most modern comics. Most are so blunt with the personal opinions of the authors that the characters cease to be characters and just become mouthpieces, and these comics read so poorly now.
It's almost like blunt force writing.
Yeah, it's exactly what it is. And we just don't, it's all in the execution, as I said. Your intent is fine as long as you know how to pull it off, which unfortunately most authors these days just lack that skill.
Well, you can always use satire. You don't have to make everything the most, most serious story in the history of the world.
No,
you
but
can
most
use
people
satire to talk about these things and have a little laugh with it on both sides, and come away and have your point come across.
Yeah, except the problem is that most of the writers now, their education in satire is from Jimmy Kimmel and Stephen Colbert and current
Jon
year
Stewart.
man, Jon Stewart and all them.
When I was in the military, I would have young people. They would come in. We would talk about current events, and you could tell that they thought like the Daily Show was news.
Yeah, and the Daily Show and the Colbert Report, and even I guess now Colbert's Tonight Show, they're all, the way those things are paced and set up is done by this crazy formula of, this is the current event, like read the headline, this is my takedown jab at the current event, cue laugh, so that I immediately discredit that news story with my joke. And the audience is trained to get headline, jab, applause sign, laugh. Headline, jab, applause sign. Headline, jab, applause sign. And it's just that exact rhythm throughout the entire spiel, the entire joke or show. And it's training the audience to react this way, and it's and everyone says Orwellian this, Orwellian that, but it is training an audience to immediately associate laughter with the complete discrediting of a news story, even if that joke is a distraction, has nothing to do with the news story. You could just be making fun of the guy's shirt, like, look at Trump, he's orange, ha 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 ha. And the news story is about the Keystone Pipeline. Like, what does Trump being orange have to do with that? Nothing. But now they'll always associate, the jab and the laugh at this news story, and they'll feel it's discredited. It's just a weird programming, a Pavlovian kind of attack on the mind, where they hear the ringing bell and they laugh, and then they associate, X with Y. And,
I remember that one guy was in the news because he had a bright red sweater on and he asked a question.
Oh, I remember that. He was the big fat guy. Yeah, I remember that.
He's got a sweater. Is like,
like what is that?
He did ask a question there, but that wasn't what the story was.
Or that one dude at NASA who landed a rover on a moving comet, and all anybody talked about was his T-shirt because he wore a dress shirt that had anime girls on it, and so everybody just attacked him for misogyny. Like, he literally landed a rover on a moving comet, something that had never been done before, and all the news can talk about is how offensive his shirt was. It's that kind of thing. And I feel like turning it back around on comics, like that's their idea of satire or addressing current events, is not addressing the content of the event. It's just pointing and laughing like, ha ha, Trump orange, ha ha ha, something stupid and distracting, because that's how they learn what satire is. And we don't see the kind of tact or strategy in addressing current events that we saw in the 70s. We have, I hate to say it, but I've talked about how I don't like the Hard Traveling Heroes arc by Denny O'Neil from Green Lantern, Green Arrow. I feel like that's what people go to when they want to, I want to learn historically how to write current event satire or current event reactions in comics. I'm going to go read Hard Traveling Heroes. Like, maybe instead you should go be reading Steve Englehart's Captain America and see a better approach to that kind of storytelling. No, but Hard Traveling Heroes is considered the standard, and it's the same reason like everybody who wants to do a deconstructionist superhero story goes and reads Watchmen, and like, oh, good God, I wish we could burn every copy of Watchmen at this point. It just feels like it's ruined everything.
That's another conversation. I do want to say thank you very much, Mark, for coming on here and talking about, when current events are the backbone of your story, you're kind of maybe setting yourself up for failure in the short and long term, and kind of some of the issues that we're seeing
you're putting your
nowadays.
Story in a box, which you kind of don't want to do as a writer, and what you shouldn't do if you want your stories to have long-term appeal.